Let's pick up where we left off, shall we? So we got to the section where we're talking about the capillary physiology. We're going to be spending a little bit of time here because this is kind of like the bullseye of actually quite a few chapters. And so the first thing we need to do is talk a little bit about the exchange mechanism that's happening at the capillaries. So of course, that exchange mechanism is all bundled into pressures. And so this is an important thing. So basically what happens is when nutrients and oxygen are moving through the capillary, the way that they exchange is by diffusion. Right? So that basically means that you have to be fairly close in order to get diffusion. And so ultimately diffusion is a piece of this mechanism. And we've talked a little bit about diffusion. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Related to diffusion, but not the same thing, is called filtration. So filtration is essentially filtering stuff like through a sieve. So diffusion is just moving stuff back and forth in response to their concentration gradients. Filtration basically it implies force, added force. Typically when you filter something. And then in addition to that, there is also reabsorption, which basically is uptake or reclamation. In this case, fluids. And those are the three biggies, right? So these are the three major mechanisms that sort of form the heart and soul of how capillaries exchange nutrients and oxygen with the surrounding tissues. Now, when we take a look at diffusion itself, this is just general bio, right? Just to remind you. So diffusion is essentially the movement of typically solute molecules, ions often, but it can also be oxygen, things like this, but they're always going to be moving from a high to a low concentration. So it's always a downhill process. Right? You may remember that from general bio. That's always the place, but it's always down, not along, but down the concentration gradient from high to low. By the way, we talked a little bit about a diffusion already in terms of this high to low movement, right? So we talked about in terms of the pressure gradients that are happening with the respiratory pump. So we talked a little bit about that. The same thing is true here. In this case, molecules are going from their high to their low in response to a pressure gradient or a concentration gradient in this particular case. Now, the important thing to understand is whenever you have a gradient, whether it's a pressure gradient or a concentration gradient or charge gradient, all these gradients are the same. They have one thing in common with them, even though they're different things, pressure versus concentration. The thing they have in common is energy. So the reason why they always flow from high to low is because they're flowing down ultimately at energy gradients. So whenever you have a disparity in pressures, it creates an energy gradient. So the high pressure is the high energy point, the low pressure is the low energy point, so you're flowing down your energy gradient. Same thing is true for concentration. The high concentration point is your high energy point, the low concentration point is your low energy point, you're flowing down your energy gradient. And it's the same for all gradients that way, and that's fairly universal. So that's one of the reasons why these things are driven to move from high to low, regardless of what it is that's the gradients. It's because they're all following their energy gradient. And so diffusionally, you're looking at a concentration gradient. So what are some of the ways that these molecules will diffuse? Well, first of all, let's take a look and see what molecules we're talking about. So primary and obvious to the pantheon of molecules that are moving is water, right? So water is the big dog here in the pack. And so you're constantly moving water back and forth. Ions like sodium and calcium, those sorts of things are happening as well by diffusion. Small molecules and things like glucose, those are all moving also by diffusion. And so when they're diffusing, typically they're going to be diffusing between different endothelial cells and also through these fenestrated capillaries. But of course, remember we learned about before that the fenestrated capillaries are sieve-like. They're little sieve-like pores. So you have to be small enough to fit through these fenestrations. If you're not, then you're not going to make it through there. Okay. And that's kind of the nature of selection. But typically speaking, with water and ions and small molecules, you can fit through those fenestrations, or you can be swapped back and forth between adjacent endothelial cells. Now, some ions like sodium and potassium and calcium and chloride will have channel. They'll diffuse through their channels. This is a type of what's called facilitated diffusion. And that's what we learned about in AMP1 when we learned about the sodium channels, right? That's basically what those ions are diffusing through. But when those channels are open, then it's the laws of diffusion that take over, right? So you're flowing from high to low, down your energy gradient. And those are some of the major routes. Another route is larger water-soluble compounds. So that basically means they're polar in nature. So some of these large ones can still pass through these fenestrated capillaries, assuming that they are still small enough to fit through there. And then, of course, lipids and lipid-soluble stuff can freely pass through the membrane because they're nonpolar. And so those don't have a problem. So they can easily pass through these endothelial membranes. All lipids and nonpolar molecules can do that. And that's because the membrane itself is nonpolar. So they don't have a problem with nonpolar molecules passing through them. They do have a problem with polar molecules passing through them, right? Because that whole relationship between hydrophobic and hydrophilic is a very adversarial one. So they're not letting water and its polar buddies through, but it has no problem with the nonpolar ones. That's handy for us. Why? Because when we get to the respiratory chapter, we'll notice that one of the things we want to do is to be able to pass oxygen and CO2 back and forth through the tissues. And once we get there, this is done by simple diffusion. Then the plasma proteins, these are basically too large for fenestrations. But you can get them to pass through if you create sinusoids in the lining. So if you got the sinusoids in the lining, then you'll be able to get these larger plasma proteins through. Notice the theme here. Basically, for diffusion routes, all you need is a gradient and an access point. That's it. If you have a gradient and an access point, you're good to go. You're ready to roll. Now, what's filtration and how does that differ? Diffusion is kind of a spontaneous drive, right? So it's naturally wanting to go down its concentration gradient. It just has to be allowed to do so. In filtration, it's a little bit different because it's not a spontaneous drive. It's actually driven by hydrostatic pressure. So this is the applied force that I was referring to earlier. And because of that applied force, you're going to be smashing the water and the small solutes. Notice there's a term forced, right? So it's forcing it through the capillary wall. So imagine in filtration, it's very much kind of like if you have a sieve and you have a fluid on this side, what you're doing is you're just basically smashing it against that sieve and kind of forcing it to sort of strain out. Very similar if you're a coffee fan or a fan of the French press, right, which is just a wire mesh. And then in that case, you push on that wire mesh, and what does it do? It basically filters the coffee, essentially, right? So you're applying that force to get kind of pack down those grounds, and that's kind of creating this sort of filtration effect. Okay, but it's an applied force. But notice you're still small. The things you're getting through by filtration are still going to be on the smallish side. All the larger stuff, the larger solutes, stays behind. And because they stay behind in the bloodstream, this adds to the concentration of solutes in the blood. That'll have an important effect later on once we get to that point we start talking about that. Now, reabsorption is going to be the reverse of filtration. And so reabsorption is the consequence of a change in osmotic pressure. In this particular case, it's a change in a specific osmotic pressure called the blood colloid osmotic pressure, or BCOP. That's an important term that you need to understand because that's one of the pressures that's at play in the capillary. What is BCOP? BCOP is essentially the pressure that is osmotic pressure created by the increasing concentration of solutes left behind in the blood. So remember, we just got done saying that as there's a filtration situation, you're shoving this water and the small solutes out of the capillary. All the big stuff is left behind. What's happening is as you're moving water out, you're concentrating what's inside. So your solute concentration on the inside of the capillary is increasing. And that creates an osmotic tension. Remember, the mantra of osmosis is salt sucks, right? So those salt piles are sucking. So as it's getting saltier and it's more concentrated in the cell, that's going to start to acquire a sucking effect, an osmotic pull. That's what BCOP is. It's the pressure associated with that osmotic sucking because of the elevation of concentrations inside the blood, because you're filtering out all the water and pushing it into the tissues, the surrounding tissues. And so now then, when we take a look at capillary exchange, what you have is this kind of like little two-step dance going on between filtration and reabsorption. So what we have then is that from filtration reabsorption, we can basically push our fluids into the interstitial tissues. That's then it becomes interstitial fluid at that point. But through reabsorption, it can also come back. So we have not just one-way communication, capillary to tissues, but now through reabsorption, we have the opposite as well. So we have tissues to capillary. So you have an equal exchange. It's kind of give and take. And so you have that kind of two-way road situation. Because you have this sort of give and take, goes out of the capillary takes it in from the tissues. It's an easy way to be able to swap back and forth and to distribute and exchange all sorts of things, including our nutrients, our hormones, gases like oxygen and CO2, and things of that nature. So because you have that sort of two-way exchange, that allows for maximum transfer, which is exactly what you want. The other thing it also does is lipids, the transport of lipids and things of that nature can cross easily through the capillary walls. And so you have easy exchange there. But it also has, and this is an important one, some of you may have been actually beneficiaries of this, but it's got a flushing action. So when you're pushing all that water into your tissues, if there's anything there that's causing harm, then this is a way to flush out that particular molecule or whatever it is. A good perfect example is like a bacterial toxin, or like a lingering drug or a medication, right? So a lot of times if you're trying to get a drug to sort of pass through your system, a lot of times they'll say drink a lot of water to kind of get that to sort of flush it out of your system a little faster. That's not just urinary, that's also capillary as well. Or sometimes if you go to the emergency room, they'll administer fluids and an excess of fluids to try to help flush something out of your system. This is exactly what they're talking about. So when you have an excess of water in your blood, you can go through filtration, you can push that into your tissues, and it'll just basically wash out your tissues and any kinds of drugs or metabolites or toxins in this particular case that might be lodged there doing damage to your cells. So it's a very, very critical technique that we use. And so because of that, then like if there's bacterial toxins, it also is in communication with your lymphatic tissues. So the one thing that you always want to understand is that in your capillaries, you also have a lymphatic presence as well. So there's lymphatic capillaries that are also involved in the capillary bed to do two things. The lymph system has two roles. The first one is obviously as a superhighway for your immune system, right? So that's one for distribution and transport of your immune cells. So that's one piece. The second piece, and probably a big piece of the lymph system's role, is for fluid absorption. So it is a major fluid absorber. It's like a sponge in your tissues that sort of absorbs excess fluid so that you don't start taking on fluid and getting edema. Okay, so your tissues don't swell. So then let's get nitty gritty now. We're talking about the interplay of filtration and reabsorption. What are we really talking about? Well, there's a series of pressures physiologically in the capillary that change as you go through the capillary. And we want to sort of introduce ourselves to some of those. The first one is what's called the net hydrostatic pressure. Now, notice we said the net. We're going to talk about two different hydrostatic pressures that are in that net and versus the net osmotic pressure. So the hydrostatic pressure is a force of water going out of the solution. So this is an outward push of water out of the capillary. Now the net osmotic pressure is the inward suck of water into the capillary. So generally speaking, control of filtration and absorption is basically comes down to control of where your net hydrostatic versus your net osmotic pressures are. As a matter of fact, when you take a look at the pressures, specifically breaking down the net hydrostatic pressure, there are two different pressures involved in this. The first one is what's called capillary hydrostatic pressure. This is essentially the blood pressure going through the capillary. And as you might well assume, this is a fairly high pressure. This is a very strong pressure inside the capillary. The other one is what is called the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, the IHP. This is the pressure of the fluid or the water in the tissues pushing into the capillary. The blood pressure, the capillary hydrostatic pressure is an outward push because the pressure is coming from the blood and it's putting pressure on the interior walls of the capillary, so it's pushing against them. That's the outward push. And the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure is an inward push. Okay, so that's the fluid of the tissues wanting to push into the capillary. Now, the net hydrostatic pressure is the difference between these two. Of course, generally speaking, usually the capillary hydrostatic pressure is usually very, very much larger than the IHP. Why? Because it's got the power of the left ventricle behind it. Remember, we got a pressurized circulatory system. It's, of course, going to be much higher pressure than the tissue, the fluid in the tissues. And so generally speaking, this system is wired to have an overall net push outward. So you take the CHP minus the IHP and you get your net. Okay. But because CHP is always much, much greater than IHP because of the pressure of your blood inside your arteries, then it's always going to be an outward push. It's always going to have the direction of moving into the interstitial fluid. And it's generally a pretty significant push. Okay. So what about the colloid osmotic pressures? What about that net? What's involved there? But just like before, you also have two of these. We already talked about the blood colloid osmotic pressure, right? So this is basically the osmotic pressure or the sucking inward force due to the concentration of solutes after filtration. But then you also have solutes in the tissues as well. And those are also going to have a sucking effect. So the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, the ICOP, this is going to be an outward sucking. This is a sucking outward effect. Due to the solutes in the tissues. But generally speaking, normally BCOP is greater than ICOP, which favors reabsorption. So generally speaking, the overall force is an inward force. So it's wired to go into the capillaries from the interstitial fluids because BCOP is greater than ICOP. That is, the forces sucking water in are stronger than the forces wanting to suck water out. That makes sense? So those are the two nets. So then your net colloid osmotic pressure would be your BCOP minus your ICOP. So then that gets us to the overall. So we bring it all together, our two hydrostatic pressures and our two osmotic pressures. Then what we get is net filtration pressure. And net filtration pressure is the difference between net hydrostatic pressure and net osmotic pressure. So basically, this is the equation. Your net filtration pressure, that is to say, the overall direction of flow, is going to be your net hydrostatic pressure, which is CHP minus IHP, right? So your capillary hydrostatic pressure minus the interstitial tissue pressure pushing back, right? Minus your net osmotic pressure, which is BCOP minus ICOP, which is the blood colloid osmotic pressure minus the interstitial tissues colloid osmotic pressure. So the difference of those two is your net filtration pressure. If your net filtration pressure is positive, this will give you filtration, because that means that your net hydrostatic pressure is greater than your net osmotic. So it's a push outward. If your NFP is negative, that means this term here is very big. That favors reabsorption, which means your net hydrostatic pressure is less than your net osmotic. So ultimately, what you really want to know is, what's your filtration pressure? What is your ultimate final filtration pressure? And that basically is what gives us exchange. So at the arterial end of a capillary, we're going to have a positive net filtration pressure. The fluid moves out of the capillary into the interstitial tissues. At the venous end, where you get collected in the venule, it's just the opposite. So you get fluid moving into the capillary and out of the interstitial fluids. So it's pushed out on the arterial end, it's taken back in on the venous end. So it's a reclamation, right? So you lose your fluid and then you gain it all back. So you kind of just exchange it. So you stick it out there in the tissues, swirl it around a little bit, wash some things out, collect a few pieces of trash perhaps, and then take it all back in. That's basically what's happening. Of course, as you go from artery to vein, there's a transition point where you essentially become venous instead of arterial, and that's a little bit different for each capillary. But ultimately, any fluid that's not reabsorbed, that's left behind, is taken up by the lymphatic vessels. So they reclaim any unabsorbed fluid. And that keeps you from swelling, from getting water in your tissues, stored up in your tissues. So, since it looks like we're into our witching hour, so time flies when you're having fun, or not. Aren't you glad we did let this part off the exam? It gives you a little. By the way, if you're wondering what we just went through, this is like hardcore physiology. I mean, this is like physiology. Like this is what it's like. This is how it is. But it's important because this mechanism here, this physiology, will inform a lot of other systems as well. Capillary physiology is the same, regardless of where you are in any other system. It just maybe gets tweaked a little bit or modified slightly. So learning this lesson now, it makes the other chapters a lot easier to digest. So we'll stop it there, and then we'll pick up with this guy here, kind of covering what we just talked about, our journey through the capillary, taking a look at this sort of interplay between these pressures as it goes through the capillary itself. Okay.